next speaker is Adam Howard. Adam is the Chief Executive of the International Churchill Society, but again, lurking behind that was a very varied career, including being the Chief Historian to the State Department. Not at all.
Good afternoon, and thank you, everyone, and thank you to our hosts, both from the Nixon Library and here at the Embassy, the French Embassy. As was just mentioned, my career has recently shifted, where I had been at the State Department, where I was the chief historian, and while I was there, one of my key tasks was to oversee the publication of the official documentary history of U.S. foreign relations. And this series is where I'll be drawing from when I discuss the Nixon administration and its relationship to its European allies during the era that we've been discussing today, which is President Nixon along with President Pompidou. My focus is on the Foreign Relations United States series because it reveals the inner decision-making process in Washington. And it's also, in this case, going to show us how allies across the Atlantic were drawn in or more often kept at arm's length. Now, the record of the Foreign Relations United States series is the official policy, or sorry, the official documentary record of U.S. foreign policy at the highest levels. And I just want to shamelessly plug my old office because they do tremendous work that you can use to research any of the talks we've heard both on this panel and other panels. It covers the years from 1861 and is most recently publishing documents of the Reagan administration. And again, it's fully searchable. And it's free. So you can look at anything you wish, download it in PDF format, or you can download it onto any tablet if you want to research any of the topics you're hearing today or others related to that time period. Now, what's so amazing to me about these documents is it's not just what they tell us when it comes to what decisions were made, but they also allow us to hear the deliberations, the disagreements, and sometimes the frustrations of the policymakers themselves, including non-American policymakers who are covered in the meetings that are covered in the types of documents you'll find, like memoranda of conversation, back channel cables, and other official US government documents. So when it comes to Nixon and Kissinger, what's the big picture as it relates to the documentary record? I would contend the most significant element here is the centralization of foreign policy in the White House. Both Nixon and Kissinger narrowed the circle of consultation, minimized the role of the State Department, and elevated back channels as their preferred tool. That worked well for speed and control, also avoided leaks to the press, but it meant for allies, especially in Europe, that they were often managed rather than meaningfully engaged. Europeans were invested in détente with the Soviet Union in questions of international monetary forum, as well as Middle East diplomacy, yet I would contend, as the archival record shows, they struggled to gain influence over US choices. And to illustrate this, I will very briefly walk through 4 case studies where these tensions came into view. The first case I will talk about is the new economic policy of 1971. In August 1971, as you've already heard, Nixon shocked the world by suspending the dollar's convertibility to gold and imposing wage and price controls. And this decision made by a small circle in the White House had enormous implications for the international monetary system. The documentary record shows how little consultations there were during this time. And as I'm sure many are familiar, Treasury Secretary John Connolly memorably told his European counterparts, quote, "The dollar is our currency, but your problem." And from the documents, you can see European leaders scrambling. West Germany, for example, faced immediate pressure to revalue the Deutschmark. French officials complained bitterly about what they saw as unilateral US action. And what stands out in the archival record is not just surprise, but also a sense of betrayal. The United States had for decades underpinned the international economic system. Yet here, in a moment of strain, Washington acted first and explained later. That set the tone for the transatlantic relationship through much of the early 70s. Second case I'll bring up is the Moscow Summit of 1972. The Moscow Summit is often remembered as a triumph for Nixon's diplomacy, agreements on arms control, expanded trade, and high symbolism in the heart of the Soviet Union. But from the transatlantic perspective, the picture looks different. The documents reveal just how carefully Nixon and Kissinger centralized control. They worried that too much European involvement would complicate the direct dealings with Moscow. West German Chancellor Willy Brandt had his own Ostpolitik, but Nixon was determined that détente would be a US-Soviet affair first and foremost. One striking memorandum shows Kissinger dismissing European suggestions as, quote, useful atmospherics, end quote, but not decisive. And I think that's telling. Washington listened, but it didn't necessarily hear. For Europeans, the symbolism of détente was welcome, but the substance was made in bilateral superpower channels, excluding them. Third case I'd like to talk about is the Year of Europe, 1973. And this phrase, Year of Europe, suggested a grand rebalancing of the alliance. The record shows that it became a case study in managed or mismanaged expectations. European governments, especially France and West Germany, were trying to find a stronger collective voice. They were talking about monetary cooperation, political consultation, and asserting themselves alongside the United States. But the documents show US officials acknowledging these aspirations, but framing them in distinctly American terms. Support for the alliance, yes, but always within the bounds of US leadership. One internal memorandum captures Kissinger's ambivalence. He called the initiative, quote, an exercise in managing expectations, end quote, rather than a genuine redistribution of influence. When the initiative stumbled, Europeans felt brushed aside and Americans felt unappreciated. The archives capture both sides of that frustration. And my last, case 4, the Arab-Israeli War of October 1973. This was truly the ultimate stress test because when war broke out, Washington responded with rapid arms shipments to Israel, followed by intense shuttle diplomacy. The documents show how decisions were made quickly in Washington, sometimes in just a matter of hours, and how little advanced consultation European allies received. That mattered enormously because the US resupply for Israel triggered the Arab oil embargo that would last the next several months. And Europe bore the brunt of that energy shock. In cables, again preserved in the documents, you see European leaders pleading for greater coordination. The French and the Dutch, for example, had diametrically opposed approaches. Paris seeking more accommodation with the Arab states, and The Hague aligning more tightly with Washington. And so the lack of early US consultation strained the alliance, but also deepened inter-European divisions. So what do these 4 cases tell us in the bigger picture? I think a few things stand out. First, the Nixon administration prized control, for better or worse. Decision-making was centralized in the White House, as I've mentioned, and frankly, often in the person of Henry Kissinger himself, who really shows through in so much of the documentation. And I'll just briefly mention, too, if you really want to get a sense of his role, how he engaged, the note taker he used, Peter Rodman, was extraordinary in the detail he provides in those documents. So you really get a sense of Kissinger's personality and how he engaged in many of the discussions that took place, not only with European allies, but around the world. So traditional processes of interagency debate and allied consultation were minimized within the United States and also abroad. Now, the second thing I would say, back channels were defining features, whether through private talks with Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin or discreet contacts with European leaders. Kissinger believed diplomacy was most effective when it was least transparent. And third, allies were not absent. They were often managed. The United States reassured when necessary, listened politely, but made decisions largely with global strategy in mind. That meant prioritizing US-Soviet relations or the Middle East balance, even when those choices carried major costs for Europe. And finally, these tensions revealed a transatlantic relationship in transition. Europe wanted a stronger, more collective role in global affairs. The United States, meanwhile, pursued a vision of global strategy in which Europe remained important but not decisive. So let me conclude with this thought. Alliances are not just about shared interests, they're also about how power is exercised and how partners are consulted. US documents remind us that decision-making style, the choice in this case to centralize, to act first and explain later, can matter as much as the substance of the policy itself. In the early 1970s, Nixon and Kissinger's style produced major diplomatic breakthroughs, détente with Moscow, the opening to China, shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East, but it also strained transatlantic trust. Europeans saw a United States acting like a global superpower first and an ally second. And that tension, the balance between US global strategy and European partnership, remains one of the enduring features of the transatlantic relationship. And it's one of the reasons why the documentary record is so valuable. It lets us see not just the outcomes, but the process by which they were reached, the priorities, the trade-offs, and sometimes the blind spots that shaped one of the most consequential eras in modern diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was always reminded of the conversation between Heath and Pompidou at their 71st